Hello friends, welcome to today's webinar. I'm Vinay Krishna from Pingala Software. It's a technology startup based on Bangalore. We work on cutting edge technologies like blockchain, IoT, AI, ML, and so on. We also help organizations on digital transformation journey, providing consulting on DevOps, agile transformation, DevSecOps, cloud agnostic solutions, and so on. Today's webinar is focused on DevSecOps, and I'm glad to have Amélie Koran with us. She is a technology therapist, advocate, and advisor, currently working at Splunt. She is having broad experience in both public and private sectors across a range of business sectors. Over 20 plus years of progressive hands-on experience in advanced technologies and cybersecurity practices, developing tactical and strategic execution goals. She led teams of over 100 staff to deliver solutions across multiple products and services, service delivery lines, utilizing agile frameworks in a DevSec environments. So once again, welcome Amélie, and thank you for your time.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Okay, great. And of course, for all of the participants, you know that format, like we will be having some discussion of, I will be asking some questions to Amélie for first 45 minutes, and rest 15 minutes we will be taking questions from you, and we will be getting that answers or replies from Amélie on those queries. So as and when you are coming across with any questions, please keep typing those or posting those in the chat window, right? Yeah, okay. So I will start with very basic question, Amélie, where I just wanted your view, and you can just help the audience to understand that, especially on the DevSecOps. So what is new in this buzzword? Because we are finding that there are lots of fancy words keep coming up. We were already having something DevOps. We started getting digested those things, those practices, breaking the silos, getting dev and operations working together, or different groups also. So isn't it a kind of DevOps only, but we are just adding one more group there, DevSecOps? So how will you explain that? Why this new buzzword required? And what is the need of this new fancy word?
Yeah, so that's actually a really good question because, you know, the DevOps has definitely been kind of one of those concepts that has gained a lot of traction. There's a lot of folks who are using it in a way that they feel comfortable, that they've gotten to a level of expertise. And it's great when you just have those, as you mentioned there, you know, the whole idea of DevSecOps is breaking down the silos. You know, think of it as a train. You have two rails, and it's very easy to kind of steer something with the two rails. Adding security is that kind of energized third rail for, you know, say like an electric train, where, you know, then you can get it to go faster. So adding security to it actually makes that train move in a better direction, better, faster, gives it more energy to move forward. The challenge is that it becomes more complex. You know, getting developers and operations folks is, you know, relatively an easy thing to do because you're only dealing with two teams. You can hash things out. You have a third team, which is traditionally a lot more conservative and risk averse in their thinking, and it starts to kind of slow down that momentum. The other challenges too is, you know, as we know from being in technology, that none of this is actually like simple. It's, you know, just imagine trying to explain it to a senior vice president, a C-level person, or even, you know, somebody who's you know, a manager who's not technical. Those concepts become very difficult, and you spend a lot of time translating. Well, even in between these silos, those realms of expertise, security doesn't necessarily beget a knowledge in operations. Operations doesn't necessarily beget a knowledge in development. So there's a lot of challenges with the knowledge transfer. And when you add security into that to create, you know, basically what is now DevSecOps, there's a lot more knowledge transfer, there's a lot more pickup, and then a lot more of that translation that needs to go on. So this is why I think the challenge with, you know, moving to a DevSecOps model is becoming more difficult for people, because they could kind of ignore somewhat the security side of the house because it was just some other silo that took care of it. Usually, you know, as we want to move left with security. that is, usually the thing at the tail end, but now trying to integrate it further on, you're creating that friction. And those are the challenges that are needing to be overcome. And you just can't do those with, adding a tool or a specific process. It's actually more of a people level integration.
Great, great. So yeah, I got your point. Basically, what we are trying to achieve here is like we were having one more kind of silos, which was from the security group, which we want to break it and we want to add it here, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's very much valid. Again, don't you think that it's another kind of or another flavor of DevOps only what we were talking about, or how does it different than that other DevOps that we were normally we are trying to see that when we have to go for DevOps implementation at organization level, you have to go for lots of restructuring, removing those boundaries, creating a single goal, and all the teams should work as a single team for that goal, right? So in that respect, don't you think that even the security group was also getting covered implicitly, not explicitly, like how we are mentioning in DevSecOps case?
I wouldn't necessarily say implicit. It's a mindset. I think one of the challenges, having been in siloed environments before, was I guess overcoming some of that friction, as I mentioned prior, which was getting the thinking to change. Developers can inherently be secure developers by learning best practices, and I think that's part of the whole concept of DevOps and DevSecOps, is sharing those best practices, getting more people to, I wouldn't say necessarily follow the rules, but basically have that kind of mindset to think about all of those domains at the same time. It's basically kind of that power of one. You're extrapolating it further and further as more and more people have that mindset, have that capability. It's a lot easier to not have to have it rely on just one person or one group or one function. It's that you can trust somebody or trust a group or trust a team to actually, instill those best practices and move forward. So, say for instance, even on the ops side, it's very easy to kind of leverage, DevOps tends to be much more developer centric, getting developers to kind of operate their own code. The addition of security, just doesn't mean that it goes strictly to be on the shoulders of the developers. The operations people, traditional folks who ran on-prem infrastructure, did the networking and so forth, still valued, still useful, still a very key member of DevOps environment, but getting them to also think about doing secure configuration management for any cloud instances, for working with developers on ensuring that, as they're requesting settings for desktop applications and stuff, they have that kind of mindset built in there, because those are where the experts lie there. I think it's very easy sometimes just to basically think it's all application based. There's a lot more that goes on to that, and then adding the security discussion into it. That's the thing, is to get a more holistic application of the security mindset across all of those teams. You're on mute.
Okay, sure. Yeah, thank you. So, okay, moving to the next question. So, who should go for this DevSecOps? Can you also share some of the examples where you observed the need and it's got implemented, and what type of benefits they were able to achieve that? Because let's try to understand the security aspect also, like does it require for all the product companies or all the different software companies who should go for this, or there is a specific need should be there and then it should get implemented? And if yes, what benefit they are going to achieve if they are going to implement this?
So I don't necessarily think it's specifically a type of application, or even where applications and systems are in their life cycle. It's a lot easier to start with a DevSecOps practice with a new application or new service, because you can be there at the time of the architecture. That's that key point of moving things left, getting there at the start, making sure that those early decisions follow best practices or a good methodology. But it's also easy too if you have a lot larger, say, a legacy environment that you're trying to transition, or those environments have gone into a operations and maintenance stage where you're still doing modifications and enhancements, you can still bring some of this framework to that. It's a little bit longer, a little bit tougher to kind of transition into that. But also you mentioned too is kind of what applications and services are best suited for this. I really believe anything could be. Everyone's we're much more mobile-centric society and culture now. Everything's done on your phone or on a tablet and so forth. So you're developing applications that have a certain kind of operating environment that is challenging. People talk about, say, zero trust. Technically, every mobile environment is zero trust because you have no idea what the carrier network is on. So that kind of creates a certain security paradigm as you're, say, developing an app. You layer things in. Certain areas have regulatory requirements. Specifically, I can speak from the U.S. side of things. But the payment card, the PCI requirements and stuff, if you're building an app that is specifically to do financial transactions, there's a certain security methodology requirements, controls, and so forth that are required for that. But say if you're building a game, maybe a little bit less so, but you can still build it securely because there's a lot of times you're asking for personally identifiable information, or PII, name, address, age, birth year, potentially addresses and phone numbers. Some people's, depending, like I said, depending on the area, the world that you're in, some of those get classified as PII. And to protect that, that's part of the whole package too, is privacy within security. I think every app and services could do that, but then, you scale all the way up to, say, developing systems for critical infrastructure, power, telephony, healthcare, and so forth. That's one of those ones where you can't just like not do it. That's one of those where it has to be built in. That's more of a more stringent requirement. But as long as you're kind of across the board, thinking about those basic requirements, that's the benefit, and that's the win for DevSecOps, because you're delivering software and services that have that thought process work through and integrated into how things go from a code and architecture to a deliverable.
Okay. So one more question on the same line. Like now, when we are going with this DevSecOps, who is responsible for this security aspect?
Again, I mean, it's one of those cases where, as you develop a team, a DevOps team or a DevSecOps team, you're not just going to staff it with developers. I mean, I think it's a little bit of a hubris thinking that developers can save the world. I went to school for computer engineering, so we were always told there's a battle between writing it in code or putting it in silicon, which was faster, which was better. The same thing goes for an environment where we are developing software and services, is that it's everybody's responsibility in a way, but you're going to need to leverage the knowledge of people who traditionally maybe came from an infrastructure background, that weren't coders, weren't developers. They have that hands-on knowledge. They're still useful. In other words, security people, they're kind of the same way. I don't think you're going to rely on developers. And I know I could get on a touchy subject here about the difference between coders and software engineers, but I think folks who do software engineering, there's a lot more of a structured methodology to how they apply software engineering principles versus somebody who maybe went to a coding boot camp that may have had a chapter on security versus, say, software engineering, where that was potentially an entire semester of talking about security engineering, secure coding practices, all the stuff involved with, say, like enterprise architecture and so forth. So those are the challenges. I think it's leveraging the right people at the right points. The big thing is, as you're doing project management for a DevOps environment, is to know, or a DevSecOps environment, is to know when to pull those experts in. I don't necessarily think that you have to have a security expert on those teams all the time, but for certain challenging aspects of those processes, is to tap those folks in. I know yesterday GitHub announced a couple products and services that were added to their offerings, and I can imagine a developer, being given these tools and wondering why. that they had a code quality checker in there, and they could basically be told like, well, this is you know, an issue with your code, but sometimes that interpretation is the challenging aspect, and that's where tapping in a security expert who understands the reasoning behind you know, why those recommendations are given, or it's exactly why you have to have a diverse team and why it's everybody's responsibility.
Yeah, that's good. And actually, I like your one statement where you were talking about that coder, like person who writes code and who are software engineers, right? Yeah, that's like a very touchy point, but yes, of course, that needs to be understood by the developers also, like writing piece of code and caring about their code is something different, right? So that's
Scaling is a big challenge. I mean, you know, writing a single application or component is much different than actually putting together an entire enterprise suite. You know, when I was leading our teams for an agency inside the U.S. federal government, you know, everybody, you know, we had close to 20 different teams, it seems like, but you know, each of them had a component into the larger whole, and the challenge was coordinating all of that. Coordinating, you know, some of the infrastructure aspects of it, coordinating some of the API integrations and so forth, and even just, you know, having somebody who managed the tools. That was also important too. Even though, you know, one team could say I'm managing that entire pipeline, you know, on a complex environment, you have to kind of share that information.
yeah, yeah. Okay, okay. So yeah. Coming to, yeah, just wanted to continue the same thing. Like, if you look at from the developers right side, and they start feeling like gradually we are giving more and more responsibility to them. Earlier, they were just responsible to write the code for any feature or any implementation that is required. And now we are talking, and there were various different groups responsible for the different things, like even that operation support team and those type of people. Now slowly looks like we are giving more responsibility to them, that okay, you have to make sure that your code should work, and you are responsible to see that okay, your code is not vulnerable. The security aspect also, you should also understand that how that IT infrastructure works, how your deployment and all those things also you should be taking care of. So uh, uh, so that so yeah, how do you see that we are giving the more and more responsibility to a certain group only, or how is it getting balanced with the different aspects, and people are actually how those security group people also getting involved here, and making that ecosystem more balanced?
Sure. Somebody has an open mic, but yeah. So yeah, one of the challenges here is you have to bring a little bit into cognitive psychology. I think we get to a point where we're now putting a lot more cognitive load on developers. You know, it's kind of like you're asking the older sibling in a family, like this is all your problem. You got to take care of your younger kids. You got to you know, bring home money to support the family, all those other things. And this is essentially kind of what happens to developers is like, well, if you want more control, you have greater responsibility. And it's like, yeah, I'm a big Marvel fanatic, comic books and so forth. You know, Spider-Man had that phrase given to him as with great power comes great responsibility. And is what we're looking for efficiencies and the ability to have greater control of the entire development process, there's a lot more responsibility. So I think that's going to be the biggest challenge, is not everybody is going to basically be able to fall into this model. Some folks, it's just too much. I think that also potentially, if not given the right tools and support, you know, can actually cause greater problems, because you're putting a lot more of those responsibilities, those needs onto one or two people. You know, if it's a small development team, or you're trying to coordinate the sharing of all that knowledge and information and those responsibilities across, you know, a development team, and that actually puts much more responsibility on it. And then, you know, then you know, from the senior level management, it's like, who do you start to blame? Is it just one person? Is it 20 people? And you know, it gets to be challenging. It gets to be much more political, and that adds a whole other perspective on just organizational dynamics. The other challenges too is its team structure. As I mentioned before, as development teams, you can have somebody who came from an infrastructure and operations background come and be part of a DevOps team, kind of as that person who's not coding but is there responsible for the deployment and operations of a particular piece of software or service. You'll now need to add that other expertise, that security person who maybe is not a coder that's going to be there on the team. So that the team structure itself will change in order to not overwhelm developers. And I think that's going to be the biggest challenge, because right now, as we've seen again and again, that security talent is one of those prized possessions right now. An organization who can get that, it's harder and harder to get those types of people in organizations, and then sharing them across, or assigning them to either one development team or sharing them across many. As much as we're putting that load on developers and that responsibility on developers, is now potentially stretching that security talent out thin across teams as well. So it gets more and more complex. I don't think there's a real answer for it, but I can easily say that I work for a company that provides tools for developers in DevOps and DevSecOps, and sometimes some of that burden can be lessened by selecting the right tools, analyzing the right data, doing automation, and kind of removing a lot of that manual tasks and decision making by selecting the right tool sets that work for their needs. You're on mute again.
Yeah. So okay. I got your point. So the next thing which I would like to understand from your perspective, like if you are talking about this DevSecOps and the selecting the tools, or maybe shift left that security aspect also, are we just talking about automation, or the kind of new type of tools like SAST or DAST or IAST, like static application security testing tools which is available right now, or dynamic application security testing tools, or interactive application security testing tool, or something more than that? So it is just like adopting those tools, and then we can just start claiming like we are implementing DevSecOps? Or how do you see that? That I understand that automation and adoption of these tools are important, and at certain extent, if you look at most of the organization where they are having these security things already there, somehow they are using these tools, maybe late in the game, but yes, somewhere they are using it, right? So how do you see that this shift left and adopting these tools, at the same times there are many other practices also which is required to be in place, or just adopting these tools?
So you actually bring up a very good point. So when I worked for Disney, I was in the enterprise architecture team, but we were hand in hand with our security architecture team. And one of the things that they decided to do was to give those security tools, some of the web security scanners and stuff, and offer them as an on-demand tool set for developers, so that as they were doing development, they were doing some testing and just, even before it even got into the release cycle, they were actually able to use those tools to kind of erase some of those, those easy hit vulnerabilities and other issues. So that's one model that you could do, is just basically provide those tools earlier on in the game, which, once it gets to a point that requires a little bit more stringent hands on keyboards, eyes on screen, most of those easy to fix issues are gone. So it removes the amount of stuff that has to be focused on. Only the real troublesome security issues, will be in that point before they go to release and have to be worked out. The other aspect too, as you mentioned about automation, I am of the mindset of automation can be good, but we're humans, and humans aren't machines, and it still will require kind of the random spot check for some quality assurance and QC. So you can only go so far, I believe, with automation, but the idea is it does remove a lot of the boring rote kind of stuff. So it gives the chance for humans in their talent is to be creative and solve problems. So when the automation aspects pops up an error, you're not popping up 200 because they could have been solved by, as I mentioned before, getting those security tools in the hands of developers earlier, and you're only left with about 5. And those 5 can then be creatively worked on by real human beings to solve those problems, rather than trying to boil the ocean with 200, where 100 of them are small minor ones that could be automatically fixed through a find and replace in some code. Another 75 can be fixed by upgrading a library, and so you're left with a smaller amount to kind of have to deal with. The other thing is too, as you mentioned about some of the tool sets and whatnot, selecting the ones that work for your environment is also important. Say with your CI/CD pipeline, just running static analysis on it isn't going to get what it's like in the real time. So you add that layer of the dynamic analysis. Even adding the concept of chaos engineering, where you're throwing random stuff at it, or doing stuff at the security level of doing fuzzing, which is, when you talk about bug bounties, most of the people who get the initial bug bounties is they're fuzzing applications. They're throwing random stuff at it and seeing what stuff, how the coders have not checked bounds, have not looked at how it handles input, and it's that kind of stuff can be automated as well. It's just knowing that what your threat landscape is like, and using multiple types of tests and randomness to kind of poke around the edges well before release. And I think some of those are very good for automation, and a lot of those may require an internal red team, an application security team to kind of go and do for you. But once they're fixed, as long as those changes and that information about what caused them through the code quality checks, or there's a cycle at the end of each sprint where those things are changed and shared with the team, that knowledge will hopefully prevent them from being introduced into new code. Or if you have multiple teams and you see a common problem across all of them, you share that across all the teams, and eventually the quality and the security of the applications and services actually rise up.
Yeah, that's good. Okay. So another thing which I would like to understand from your side is, if you have to just tell us, like, okay, and that will be like lots of things we have heard in bits and pieces. Like, if DevSecOps, some organization has decided to adopt, what is the success recipe for them? What should be the thing that they should start adopting, or look at, like, okay, these are the things, let's start streamlining, and those practices they should inbuild there, whatever. So based upon your experience, what could be the success recipe for this DevSecOps adoption?
There's a little noise coming through, so I think I'll try to interpret your question, which was, what is the threshold that... Good? Okay, sorry. I think what I got your answer, or your question was, is, how do people approach moving to DevSecOps? I would believe, what's the threshold? You don't have to be all in. You can pick smaller projects, dip your toe in for them. You're testing your maturity. I think not every organization is ready to move to DevSecOps. It may be a little bit of one and a handful of another. Finding applications and projects and services and capabilities that you want to enable that would see if you have the right skill set. Something small sometimes, just to see, you do a proof of concept. Will this process work? Do we have the right skill sets? It's a matter of identifying it. I don't think anybody can just walk in and say, this is what we're going to do. You're going to have to kind of test the waters, because it's an iterative process. Knowing which tools that you need, which kind of talents and staff that you need, even at the level of organizational maturity, knowing that you have the right type of engaged product owners, the right type of management structure, and knowledge transfer, and sometimes even getting down to where the budget is. trying to explain to a CIO or CFO that, well, we're going to do much more security related stuff, so we're going to need these tool sets, or we're going to need another an additional headcount. When you have a chance to kind of basically do a test run through things, it makes making those arguments or having those discussions a lot easier. The other thing is too is size is a challenge. I mentioned I come from the U.S. federal government, and some organizations have a lot of inertia. It's very hard. They're large. They've done things always the same way forever and ever, and getting them to move is also very difficult. So having a very small, fast team kind of come in and try to change that may provide some problems. It's getting people to change their thought processes and how they approach stuff. But if you're a born digital company, something that's been was always in the cloud, or was always using modern practices, that's a very easy switch typically, because most of those folks have that mindset. They've been through that before. But if you're an organization that traditionally has not done this would require a lot more on that kind of test the waters scenario.
Good. Yeah. Okay. So one more thing which I feel that even that audience will be looking for, that like when DevOps started, that movement started, and we started getting lots of new type of role in the market, like DevOps engineer, DevOps architect, and so on. Now, what do you feel like a DevSecOps engineer supposed to do? What? Yeah.
Yeah, as you mentioned the question before, it's you're kind of breaking down the silos, but you're adding more onto it. I don't think there's a really good answer for that. If you're gonna, just like we have a challenge with developers of finding if they're a Ruby developer, a Python developer, or they like to code in C or Go or Erlang or whatever. There's also a flavor of security knowledge too. There's network security professionals, there's AppSec professionals, there's folks who, do forensics and things like that. So, just saying like, well, I'm a coder and I've done some forensics, or I've done some reverse engineering, that may not necessarily be a translatable skill set to basically call yourself a DevSecOps engineer. I think specifically the most useful people I found in security are generalists. They've kind of had their fingers in a lot of different pies, because it's just that they understand that entire security lifecycle. So now you're kind of adding that to the development lifecycle. So the security development the system development lifecycle and the security development lifecycle, or system development lifecycle, kind of start to interact. And there's those touch points. And calling yourself a DevSecOps engineer is going to be very complex, because you're going to need to have that entire understanding of the security cycle and the development cycle, and they touch at certain points, but they're not always congruent. So I think that's going to be the biggest challenge in the workplace going forward, is being able to differentiate folks who are really good security generalists that will add something to a DevOps environment, versus selectively saying, well, I have a little bit of this security thing, but I'm just going to throw it onto my developer skill set and call myself a DevSecOps engineer.
Okay. So if a developer wants to follow this journey of DevSecOps, so how can he start from? Where he should focus?
Well, the one thing would be is do a lot of reading. I think being that I came from the security environment well before I became an infrastructure operations person, or even before I've done development, was just getting a wide breadth of understanding what would be the requirements for, say, forensics. If if I was you wanted to make it easy for somebody to do some reverse engineering on it, maybe not encrypt my code, or whatever, but getting an understanding of like what all the various principles are within the security arena, and understand all those touch points are, but you don't have to become an expert in all of them, just to be aware of like what those requirements are. The other aspect is too is you know, as you're developing stuff, you understand that there's going to be security operations teams outside of DevOps. So you're still going to have a NOC, you're still going to have a SOC on occasion, depending on the scale. So if you're developing an application or service and you're in charge of writing the logging algorithms for that application, you make sure that they're in a standard format that a SOC or a NOC or, you know, a managed security provider can consume. That's a good mindset to have, is make sure, you know, your application, you know, spits out usable logs for folks who actually have to go and track all of that stuff. I know I'm kind of stumbling on this question because it's a really broad question, because I don't think anybody's really kind of come up with a good you know, kind of a model for that kind of next generation developer or DevOps person. Yeah, I'm struggling right now just trying to think, because you know, I go to the places like DEF CON and B-Sides conferences and stuff like that. And yeah, everybody I run into in the security arena has all sorts of different talents, and they would never want to become a developer. Conversely, I don't think a developer wants to walk into a security conference and say, well, I'm this security expert. So there's a lot of challenge of trying to figure out where to start. And I think that's why I'm kind of scratching my head here. It's good to become a generalist for awareness, but to have to dig through and become a specialist in all those things, I think is probably maybe potentially a fool's errand.
Yeah, okay. I guess over the period of time when it will start getting more maturity, and even the developers will start getting more involved on the security aspect, probably that time it will be easy to get to that particular path. But yes, of course, right now, yeah, I understand that will be too hard, because even the security group, so far it was their silos, and there were not that much awareness even from the developer perspective also, like how the security the groups works and where they focus and all those things, right? So it was the same thing what I was looking at, like some time back when the DevOps was evolving, and we were coming up with like a DevOps engineer, and mostly we were getting that ops guys who were just rebranding themselves as a DevOps engineer, right? So
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, okay. We are getting lots of questions. I would like to start taking that, because otherwise we will not be able to cover all. But let me just start taking that. So there is one question, and is just asking that what is the difference this DevSecOps from the CloudOps?
Oh yeah. So I kind of there's an internal joke within our team right now, because as I kind of kick the stones a little bit in this river of DevOps, is there's an you know, asterisk wild card character ops now. There's FinOps, there's ChatOps, there's NetOps, there's SecOps. And I think that's one of the challenges right now is everybody's purposely, it was this unifying concept, and now it's this fracture. Because you know, it's really hot and sexy to say something ops, and I think that's one of those challenges right now, is demystifying what it really kind of means. And we tried to kind of you know, talk about that here. So say like for SecOps is one of the challenges we have here. You know, that was a rebranding of the folks who worked in the Security Operations Center. So those are folks who are focused on monitoring and incident response, and as I mentioned before, like some of the computer forensic stuff. You know, saying that as DevSecOps, that's different, because I don't think there's anybody from you know, a SOC that has that level of development experience. As you mentioned before, you know, that whole that concept of rebranding you know, an ops person into the DevOps environment. I think that's the challenge as well, is you know, now with all this fracturing and then rebranding of FinOps, it starts to add confusion in what's basically necessary for the skills.
Okay, yeah. So another question that we have is there any standard tool to cover security aspects, application vulnerability, or anything else, which can be integrated with CI/CD pipeline?
You know, as I mentioned before, is the advantage about all of this is finding the right tool set that works for not only your model. So, not everybody's using the same tools in their CI/CD pipeline. Some folks like Jenkins, they've got Ansible, they may have SonarQube in for code quality. They may have a different tool for, say, orchestration in their Kubernetes containers. So I don't think there's any real one standard tool set. Some stuff may be something your organization has purchased before that has a CI/CD integration that works, and then you're doing the gap analysis to basically find out what particular tools may drop in. However, not talking specifically about tools, you're starting to look at functions. So, as I mentioned about some of the orchestration stuff, that's a key component of CI/CD pipeline. Logging and monitoring is one of those. Application performance management. So once you look at the concepts you're trying to address, then you can kind of match those with tools. But I don't think there's any kind of like cut and dry. The challenges too is, I work for a vendor, and I'm trying not to be particularly picky about saying choose us, but the advantage is when you do find a tool set that works with you, or you're trying to find that tool set, you ask around. That's the greatest thing about the technology community, is it is a community. It's an environment where you can ask questions, get feedback, burnished or otherwise, finding out what's good and what works. And it is somewhat evolutionary, because good stuff is always going to be hopefully good stuff, because they're engaged with their customers and they're willing to add features and capabilities that those customers need, versus ones that you're struggling and fighting with. So, the question about picking tool sets is find one that works for how your business works, how your environment works, but also is willing to work with you. I think that's the only way any of this stuff gets better.
Yeah, that's correct. And just to add a few things here, what you can do is there are different type of application security tool, like static, dynamic, interactive, based upon your technology and your context, right? What works for you, you can have a look on whatever the options are available. And then of course everywhere, like most of the CI/CD tools, right, which you are adopting at your side, will be having some plugins to add those tools there, right? So yes, of course.
Yeah, I think that's a key point. I was tweeting out about GitHub Satellite had their conference yesterday, and they were announcing a couple new capabilities that they're offering their basic platform. And I tweeted out about something, and I tagged one of these companies. I said it's really kind of nice to have that built in, but it looks like GitHub, and I'm sure GitLab and similar type of code repository environments have this. But if they have an extensible API for plugging in applications to, I know GitHub has actions, you can use those into your tool sets. I think that's the other key thing, is finding what environments are extensible that allow you to swap tools in and out. I know working for HHS, we originally chose a different data backend, and we found that it couldn't scale, and it was a week it took us to swap out a new one. So, not only are you required to kind of build that architecture, but understand that those environments where you're deploying, talking about CloudOps before, selecting the right cloud architecture that allows you to swap out components easier as your demands and use potentially it increases. So those are the things you need to ask of your vendors and partners as well.
Okay. Yeah, sure, definitely. So another question, and that's good for everyone to know, like, can you also help the audience to start with exploring this DevSecOps? If you can recommend, or you have something like a good websites where they can just go and read about, or any books that they can read, and they can start exploring on this area.
Unfortunately, I hate to say that there's not a really great corpus of books out there on it, since it's so new. I think I was bemoaning the fact that I was trying to document this for some work I'm doing here at Splunk. That DevSecOps literally has a tiny little paragraph in Wikipedia, so it's not really well defined. It's just kind of like, well, here you have DevOps, and then there's this new thing. But generally, I would, Google searches are turning up new stuff every day. So, if you're in it, I don't have anything to point to, but A lot of the vendors and tool companies have their own perspective on things. I'm currently writing our own DevSecOps guide right now from the perspective of how do you add security into a DevOps environment, but also working on developing a map. And I would love to eventually share this out is if you're a developer, here are these things you need to know about your ops and infrastructure and security to support them in a good way. And if you're coming from security and you're trying to support a development environment, here are some things that you're doing already that are supporting that. So understanding those threads and those tie-ins. There's not a lot of really great models out there. They're all, I wouldn't say necessarily a little lost, but we're on new frontier at this point. So as they kind of come up, I know a lot of folks have probably read a lot of the Gene Kim books, the Phoenix Project, the Unicorn Project, and stuff like that. As I mentioned earlier on, the DevSecOps and DevOps models are really more of a human-based relationship and knowledge sharing model than it is particularly any tight skill sets. So even just reading things like that of how to overcome those challenges and dynamics are actually probably the first thing I would point people at, rather than anything specifically for technical skill sets.
Okay, yeah. So I have two questions which I feel like can be a part of that, one sequential. So I will just read it out. So the one question is, why is it called a DevSecOps if it just concerned about security of a code, right? That is one part. And then another question by another participant is like, when reading about security, there are lots of different areas mentioned: application security, information, network, IT, software. So what are differences between them? Who is responsible for that? So in DevSecOps perspective.
Mm-hmm. So to kind of address that first part first, is that it's not just application security. I know we're very much structured now in the mindset of infrastructure as code. So yes, somewhat, but understanding that architecture component, as you are gluing together services, if you're looking at, say, an Amazon S3 storage service, an Elastic Compute, or you're going as far as where you've matured from using containers to where you're using serverless, that's not a developer thing. That's somebody who understands architecture and services. And security itself too is understanding how to connect those securely. It's great that a lot of cloud providers generally ship those services relatively secure. Part of the biggest challenges, if you read anything about data breaches in the last year and a half or so, has been where developers actually specifically reduced the security on, say, an S3 bucket, or change the configuration on a service or capability, or basically neutered the security on a Lambda function or whatever. That's the security mindset. That's not necessarily having to write secure code. That's understanding the reason this configuration is in this way is because it processes this data securely. And that's an architecture and engineering, and less so on a developer. I think too, when you're talking about skill sets, is getting those types of skill sets in to know that, part of this is configuration management, vulnerability management, because a configuration change is a vulnerability. The testing aspect, most people, in traditional software development, testing in QA was this room off to the side that you just kind of slipped pizza under the door or whatever to feed them to do this stuff, but they're an integral part of this environment that is understanding what happens when you give an environment stimulus and you get a response back. Traditionally, you're going to go and poke and prod, and you're going to keep getting a green light, but when you get a yellow light or a red light, what does that mean? How can you interpret that back out? Is it an engineering change? Is it something within that deployment environment that you need to kind of make a change? Is it an additional test we need to add? Or is it something that needs to float back to developers that they need to kind of modify this code because there was a library upgrade or a change? I think one of those things would be like anybody who tracks OpenSSL, way back when you had the Heartbleed issue, understanding that you'll need to particularly change how you work with that library. Again, too, is as you're doing configuration changes, say for I think it wasn't Experian, it was I forget which one of the the data companies, TransUnion or Experian, I think, when they had their breach, it was Apache Struts, and that was a configuration issue as well, with a lot of other components, and being able to understand how to track library imports and configuration management at that level. That's a skill set as well, but that's not always on a developer. That's a tool set. That's the library management. That's part of that CI/CD pipeline. That's that architecture.
Cool. Okay. Yeah. So the next question, if I'm looking at here, so are there products which provide DevSecOps as a service, which we can plug our code workflows into? And you have referred something like a GitHub service is offering such type of service there, or how is it?
I don't think there's a plug and play. There's no out of the box DevSecOps. If there was, I would probably love to join that company because they've solved the world's problems. But generally, you're still stitching together tool sets. But there are, so I did the slide for Splunk for some of our own sales stuff. Whereas you're looking for your CI/CD pipeline, there's the build, there's the deploy, and so forth, the testing and whatnot. And there are I consider that kind of a chain or a process, and there's tools you can kind of plug into there. So as you deploy, you want to make sure you have monitoring, so you look for monitoring tools, and there's different requirements for each part of those environments, and you'll find the tool sets that work with that. As I mentioned about GitHub, they're kind of more on the left side of the CI/CD pipeline. Once you get out of GitHub and you're using an action to say deploy to Amazon or Azure or GCP, that's kind of where that part of that leaves off. So you're going to need to jump to either a different tool set or start to use the native tools of those cloud providers to do that. I think the challenge right now is, you'll have part of that left-hand side and that right-hand side that'll have certain parts of that tool set, is looking at some of those ones that can consume data from those two environments and make sense of it, put it in a dashboard, give it situational awareness, allow incident response, understand, say application performance management, to even allow some level of high-level orchestration of that, tied into the performance management. I, again, won't necessarily toot the horn of my current employer, but that's one of those tool sets that are there. There are other vendors and stuff out there that perform that. So I think it's across the CI/CD pipeline, but then at different levels of abstraction based on the information and data that's coming out of those, what you want to kind of connect and be able to act upon.
Good. So the next question somebody has asked, can you just give some examples of DevSecOps tools that is being used? Any tool that
I think we went over some of this before. I mean, there isn't just a DevSecOps tool. It's you're tacking on capabilities to something you should be already doing. Everybody's moving now to kind of containers or serverless. A lot of, say for Kubernetes security, finding tool sets, if you're choosing to deploy in containers, finding tools and services that allow you to test the security of those, both in the development lifecycle as you're building those containers, as you're doing the imports and configurations for those, but also once they're deployed, automating potentially some of the red teaming, the pen testing on that to ensure that as those containers are stuck together and are exchanging data, that they're doing so in a secure fashion, or they're not exposing something if those containers are ones that are publicly facing. So it isn't just a tool that you can go and buy. You're going to have to understand, based on the technologies that you use, what tools are best for that. I think the best tools are ones that provide very useful, actionable information. As I mentioned before, like the code scanning from GitHub, which is part of the Visual Studio Online, SonarQube, anything that's providing next level data that can both be interpreted by a security team, saying that a particular method that's in use by somebody is being done in a very insecure fashion, gives the security team an awareness to allow them to retroactively go through a code base, or to change the monitoring methodology they may have, say for an intrusion detection or a application firewall or something, to mitigate those things, but also on the other hand, to provide guidance to developers to make those changes back in the development lifecycle. So finding those tools that do that potentially serve both needs, is probably the best methodology, rather than just hope that there's a silver bullet for a particular tool that just solves all of those problems. So again, it just goes into looking at what your needs are, what you have available, and where you are in that maturity.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. One more question that is there, I guess maybe in our conversation it has been answered, but if you would like to just stress out that also, that will be good. So the question is, DevSecOps, what is the role and scope in terms of regular ops?
I'm trying to figure out what that question was, because I'm looking here in the questions on the right here. So the difference between like.
So maybe that question is like, how is it different than the regular ops in terms of role and scope?
Oh, okay. Well, that, I mean, I think of it like regular ops. Like for me, back in the day, it was doing images for your servers and stuff like that. That's, you could just pop a CD in and hope that you're doing that. Now you're managing images, virtual images, containers of a certain instance of a version of the operating system or configuration overlay. That's much more interesting, because you're going from what was kind of bare metal and you could unplug a wire, where you're now having, specifically in the cloud or in containers, where there's a transient ethereal nature to their existence. It's very, very deep and philosophical, but the idea that an instance that's spun up with a certain configuration and certain capabilities exists only for a moment that they're in need. That's the biggest challenge between traditional ops and cloud operations and DevOps and DevSecOps, is that is tracking when those things are instantiated, what they do, what they perform, and the results from that, and getting that log, so that if you are searching for errors and vulnerabilities and incidents from a potential attacker, is those states no longer exist. So you're kind of, you're trying to almost like ghost track sometimes. And I think that's a different mindset for folks in ops, because before they could walk down the hall and go to a data center and find that machine that performed that. And now it's in the cloud, where it existed for potentially less than a couple seconds just to perform that transaction. And that's a tough mindset for anybody who's transitioning from a traditional basic operations mindset to this new environment that has been very, very tough in places that I've worked and folks I've spoken to. It makes definitely the security side of the house a lot more difficult, because unless you're tracking and maintaining states of those machines, virtual machines or containers, or even sometimes the serverless actions forever and ever, tracking down and solving those problems and doing those investigations is very difficult. So I think that's the biggest challenge we're going to have to make, is that mindset of you're not always going to get the data. And that's why I touched on why logging is important, because at least you have a story to tell, even though you may not have the evidence.
Yeah, great. We are coming to the end, and before we will end, I just want to summarize that entire thing. Like, if you look at DevSecOps is nothing like for a kind of product. It is like for any type of application that we are building, we should go for that. And at the time when we are delivering and we are getting encouraged to deliver in the productions very frequently, right? At that time, the security is a very, very big concern in that case. Like, okay, whether we have done all the security aspect checked and verified, rather than getting verified at the production, right? So that is something which we have to look at, and that's the reason we are talking about, like, can we shift left? And everybody should be responsible for that, not only the security group. And that's the reason we are asking about, can we break the silos between dev, op, and sec security guys, and we can just work as one team. The second part, which Amélie was talking about, like the automation part is important, but we have to look at like, okay, what tools fits into our context, that we have to go for that, and we cannot go blindly for that any type of automation, right? So we have to be very judicial on that case. Look at like what is available in the that particular field and what makes sense for you, and do it on effective way on that case, right? And last but not least, right, it's a mindset, like we have to change a lot in the organization level, that how we are working and looking at different perspective, right? So yeah, overall that is what, if you'll ask me in the short, right? And thanks, Amélie, for joining us for this webinar. It was really knowledgeable and helpful for getting answers with expert like you. Hope everybody has got enlightened with that. And thanks all of you who has joined for this webinar. We really felt like it was valuable for you when you have spent this much time here, right? Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Take care. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.